The title of this panel, perhaps presciently, was titled Biennales and Beyond. And while we may reflect on the Biennale, which more than any other institution in the art field mediates the local, the national, and the transnational, and is seen as a key format through which contemporary art circulates globally, it is perhaps the beyond that is increasingly becoming more crucial. For today, a time marked by intensifying geopolitical conflict, there are missiles flying all over, ecological crisis, and deepening inequities. The very premise of global exhibitions demands renewed scrutiny. What does it even mean for large-scale exhibitions to exist in the present moment? Are these platforms still viable sites of cultural exchange, or do they produce the very hierarchies they claim to challenge? Historically shaped by Eurocentric frameworks, national representation, and cultural diplomacy, biennales have long functioned as stages for visibility and soft power. As our world gets fractured across even deeper fault lines, can such structures meaningfully respond to the urgencies of the present? What do they serve, and at what cost? The ambition of this panel is to unpack, through personal case studies and the different vantage points of the speakers, the changing cartographies of biennales in our region. Does one continue to think of biennales within the hegemonic frameworks of globalization, soft power, tourism, etc., or are there other more pertinent, even urgent alternative configurations within which to frame a biennial? Can it rethink power relations, transnational solidarities using new internationalism as a strategy? Can a biennale emerge based on questions of labor in a hyperlocal landscape? And can a biennial invert the perception of an erstwhile politically restricted state by presenting a version of how the outside world is viewed from within, something that's really got destroyed right now? How does one deal with infrastructures and precarity of one kind or another as we curate a biennial? Can biennials afford to become slower, smaller, and less visible without losing relevance? And crucially, who gets to decide what an exhibition should be today? I don't know, but maybe the future of exhibitions is no longer about where they happen, but how they redistribute power, resources, and knowledge. And with that, I'd really like to invite our speakers to address at a time which is very difficult, but to talk about what we have done in the past and where we're looking into the future. So can I ask you, Siddharth, to come and talk about the Bengal Biennale?
Before I begin, I would like to thank all of you who have made this time to join us today. Meera Mendes for the invitation, to the Anant, is it visible? Okay. Anant Curatorial Forum, Mamata Singhania for the patronage to art and for keeping discourse at its center, and the team behind the forum, and of course my wonderful panelists today who have contributed immensely to the field and have been an inspiration to me as well. Now, without further ado, let's move on to the matter at hand. Over the last 3 decades, the Biennale has become one of the dominant formats through which contemporary art circulates globally. It creates visibility and infrastructure, but often at the cost of flattening local specificities into globally legible forms. The Bengal Biennale began within this tension, not as a rejection of the format, but as an attempt to recalibrate it from within a specific geography, Shantiniketan and Kolkata, which have both played a seminal role in the history of the region. In my mind, perhaps owing to my own limited exposure to the international biennales, it began with a simple but difficult question. What happens if a biennale grows from soil outward rather than from spectacle inward? The curatorial idea of Anka Baka, the winding path rather than the straight line, became a useful way of thinking about these movements. Before moving into specific exhibitions or exhibits, let me briefly outline how I am approaching this talk. Rather than presenting the Biennale as a chronological survey, I want to read it through a few cross-currents that have shaped the region today. First, the question, of land and ecology, how landscape and environmental stress enter artistic practice. Second, the histories of labor and production, particularly through textile traditions deeply tied to Bengal's colonial and industrial past, or artistic practices such as kantha and batik. And third, questions of belonging, language, and freedom, which emerge in works that deal with community, nationalism, and memory. Moving through these areas allow us to see how the Biennale gradually expands its field, from terrain to labor to social imagination. Shantiniketan is not a neutral art town founded by Rabindranath Tagore as an ashram and later as Vishwabharati University. It carries a pedagogical, artistic, and philosophical history. Artists like Nandalal Bose, Binod Bihari Mukherjee, and Ramkinkar Baij shaped its visual language. But Shantiniketan today is also changing rapidly. Land is being developed, tourism puts its own pressures, the horizon narrows, the famous Kowai laterite ravine landscape shaped by erosion is fragile. The Kopai River shifts with monsoon cycles. Here, landscape no longer remains a scenery, it emerges as a contested zone. For me, two archival photographs of a house built in 1968 became an unexpected starting point. When I first visited the site in Shantiniketan to consider whether it might host an exhibition, these images were still hanging inside the building. They showed the house opening onto a very different landscape, a vast horizon where the Kowai stretched outward and the Kopai River remained visible in the distance. Today, that horizon has largely disappeared. Development has narrowed the landscape, and the relationship between the house, the river, and the ravine has been interrupted. These images quietly reveal something important. This suggests that the relationship between soil, water, and habitation in Shantiniketan had changed. The house became a hinge for exploring this relationship. Outside, in the garden, surrounding the house, Shonjoy Ghosh's Anatomy of Landscape unfolded, a long-term collective study of land. Workshops with farmers, poets, and performers traced the gestures of labor embedded in the soil. Conversations were recorded, and the land was approached not as a scenery, but as a lived terrain. Inside the house, the exhibition, Water Tells Water Tales, examined another dimension of the same ecological condition. The project brought together economist Abhijit Vinayak Banerjee and the graphic novelist Sharnath Banerjee to explore groundwater depletion across India, linking agricultural policy, crop cycles, and extraction economies. Installed within this Shantiniketan house itself, located in laterite landscape where soil retains very little moisture, the project expanded the Biennale's frame beyond art practice. Economics entered the exhibition space. Ecology was no longer a metaphor. It rather became the structure. The house thus functioned as a small archive of Shantiniketan itself, holding within it both the memory of the land and the pressures of water that now shape the region. During monsoon flooding, Shantiniketan's fields turn into water bodies. Trees appear to rise from submerged earth. It was in this condition that Nikhil Chopra encountered the terrain for the very first time. When Land Became Water was a 10-hour performance that unfolded through slow drawing with burnt wood. The charcoal produced black dust, a residue of combustion. The body labored in real time. The drawing accumulated like sediment. The performance did not illustrate climate instability. It enacted it. Land, water, body entangled in this piece. If the first movement of the Biennale examined the pressures of the landscape, Pressures on Landscape, another set of works turned towards the histories of labor that emerged at the intersection of land, production, and artistic practice. In Bengal, soil has long been inseparable from systems of production, particularly through textile economy shaped by indigo cultivation, weaving traditions, and dyeing practices. At the Alipur Jail Museum in Kolkata, once a colonial prison, Bappaditya Bishwas presented liberation inside what had historically been the prisoner's weaving room. During the colonial period, prisoners were compelled to weave textiles as part of the disciplinary regime of the jail. Within this charged site, Bishwas revisited Bengal's indigo history, particularly the plantations along the rivers such as Ichamoti, where farmers were forced to cultivate indigo under exploitative colonial arrangements that eventually led to the indigo revolt of 1859-60. Through jamdani weaving, metallic threads, and experimental loop techniques, the artists transformed garments into tactile archives of colonial exploitation and contemporary reinvention. Visitors could engage directly with these materials and processes of weaving, a sensorial experience, if you will, like what Madeline discussed this morning. Textile here was not displayed as a decorative craft, but it was activated as a labor history. This approach also resonated with projects engaging jacquard technologies, such as those by Archana Hande. The jacquard loom with punch card system represents one of the earliest programmable structures in industrial history, often described as a precursor to modern computing. Pattern here was not simply ornamental, it was encoded labor, yet textile labor in Bangla or Bengal does not exist only within plantations or factories. It also exists within homes. This dimension emerged in the project Kanthar Ghar, developed by artists associated with the Shantiniketan-based initiative GABA. The project worked with homemakers in Birbhum who traditionally stitch kathas within domestic spaces, practices rarely recognized within formal art or craft histories. Rather than presenting these textiles as anonymous craft objects, the project foregrounded the women themselves as makers. Each katha carried fragments of personal memory, transforming cloth into a stitched autobiography of everyday life. Katha here becomes more than the fabric. It became a record of domestic labor, resilience, and presence within the changing landscape of Shantiniketan. Another project, Durji Khana, by the Bangladeshi collective Britto, expanded this conversation beyond the region. Garment collages sourced from Bangladesh were reassembled in Shantiniketan, drawing attention to the global circulation of textile labor and the fragile socio-political ties between the two Bengals. The garments traveled for the exhibition, but the artists themselves were denied visas owing to the political circumstances of the day. Cloth crossed the borders, bodies could not. From here, the Biennale's inquiry gradually shifted from questions of landscape and labor toward questions of belonging. Belonging is not abstract in Shantiniketan, it is negotiated daily between locals and visitors, between Shantali and Bengali communities, between the institution's history and its changing present. Sudhir Patwardhan's paintings and sketches enter the Biennale within this context. His work has long explored the lives of workers and commuters in Mumbai, figures who share space in trains, streets, and public squares, yet often remain enclosed within their own worlds. His drawings capture a paradox of urban life, the intimacy and anonymity existing side by side. People are physically close, yet emotionally distant. Installed in Shantiniketan, a place originally imagined by Rabindranath as a cohesive ashram community, these images acquire another significance. They subtly raise a question: how does a community sustain itself over time? In Patwardhan's work, the possibility of belonging always exists, but remains fragile. Labels such as insider and outsider constantly threaten to fracture the idea of a shared space. Seen in Shantiniketan, the painting asks how communities are formed and how a sense of belonging must be continually renegotiated through the lives of individuals. If Patwardhan's works ask how a sense of belonging emerges within a community, the next question becomes whose voices and languages are recognized within that community. Mithu Sen's I Am Olchiki made this negotiation even more precise. The project, created in collaboration with Shonnashi Lohar and his team, brought the Santali script onto the mud walls of Pearsonpulli, a Santal village within Shantiniketan where art students often go to study rural life. At one level, the gesture appears simple, Olchiki letters painted across village walls. But the act carries a deeper resonance. The Olchiki script, developed in the 20th century by Raghunath Murmu for the Santali language, appears here in a cultural landscape long shaped by Bengali literary and artistic histories. The script was not decorative, it was declarative. A language that belongs to the landscape was made visible within the landscape itself for the very first time. And in doing so, the project gently reactivated a lineage already present in Shantiniketan. From the murals of Nandalal Bose and Binod Bihari Mukherjee to the public works of K.G. Subramaniam, art here has historically been imagined as something embedded within everyday life rather than confined to galleries. Mithu Sen's intervention echoes that tradition, but also shifts it. If earlier murals narrated shared cultural memory, I Am Olchiki foregrounds a language that has long existed within the region, yet remained marginal to its institutional narratives. That said, this was not confrontational, but an example of cohabitation. The work did not attempt to replace Shantiniketan's dominant cultural language. Instead, it made another presence legible, one that has always been there but had rarely been acknowledged within the visual language of the institution. One could say that the space was shared without casual erasure. If Mithu Sen's works revealed the presence of another language within the landscape, Mahesh Baliga's paintings turn towards the icons that have historically shaped Shantiniketan's cultural memory. His works revisit familiar figures and places, Ramkinkar Beji's Gandhi, the Upasana Griha or the prayer hall, and even Rabindranath himself. But instead of reaffirming these icons, Mahesh renders them strangely fragile. Gandhi appears diminished by dereliction within the changing quiet landscape. Tagore appears almost spectral, encountered like a fleeting apparition. The glass prayer hall of the Upasana Griha feels unsettled rather than serene. In Mahesh's paintings, Shantiniketan begins to appear like a place revisited by someone searching for an earlier promise. The landscape remains, but their meanings seem to altered. What once carried a strong pedagogical and cultural aura now appears uncertain, even haunted. Heritage stands, but it is no longer secure. The painting gently suggests that the inheritance is not simply something to preserve. It is something that must continually be questioned. If Mahesh Baliga's paintings destabilize Shantiniketan's inherited icons, the Biennale also prompted another question. How have images helped shape the imagination of the nation itself? One of the most powerful early visualizations of that imagination is Abanindranath Tagore's Bharat Mata, painted in 1905 during the Swadeshi movement. The image presents the nation as a spiritualized figure holding grain cloth, scripture, and mala or rosary, offering a vision of India grounded not in territorial power but in ethical and cultural renewal. Yet, when this painting is encountered today inside the Victoria Memorial in Kolkata, the setting introduces an unavoidable irony. Created during an anti-colonial cultural movement, the painting was shown within a monument originally built to commemorate the British Empire. a nationalist icon, appears within a colonial structure. History holds back upon itself. Again, Pushpamala N revisits this image through her performance, embodying the figure of Bharat Mata herself. By inhabiting the role rather than merely presenting it, she shifted the nation from allegory to body, from an idealized figure to a lived and vulnerable presence. If these works revisit the symbolic imagination of the nation, the question of freedom itself was confronted more directly in Sheila Gowda's installation at the Alipur Jail Museum. Installed in cell number 5 of the former colonial prison, Gowda's work unfolded within a space already charged with memory. Visitors had to pass galleries commemorating freedom fighters before entering the cell where the installations were placed. The dialogue therefore shifted quietly from the heroism of the past to the unease of the present. Triangular forms rise with defiant verticality, yet remain hollowed out, suggesting structures that appear stable while concealing histories of extraction and erasure. Cow dung, material, both sacred and abject in Gowda's practice, appear alongside collaged newspaper images, confronting the normalization of violence in contemporary society. Nearby, the fluorescent orange rope rise as if defying gravity, evoking the famous colonial Great Indian rope trick illusion and turning spectacle into a meditation on belief and manipulation, while surveillance is all-consuming as marked by Big Brother's glaring eyes. A site once associated with the struggle for independence becomes a space where the meaning of freedom is re-examined. Gowda's work transforms the cell into a space of interrogation, asking what freedom might mean today and how fragile its promises can become over time. I think I have taken more time than allotted. So to conclude, my feeling is that the Biennale format in itself is not inherently problematic. Its consequences depend on how it is structured. In Shantiniketan and Bengal, the attempt was to see whether the format could be approached differently, whether a Biennale might grow from the terrain it inhabits rather than from the pressures of visibility or scale. In this process, the exhibition began to draw from multiple sources: the landscape itself, histories of labor and production, linguistic and cultural negotiations within the region, and the ways in which heritage continues to be questioned. Working within constraints of scale, resources, and context, the Biennale gradually took shape, less as a spectacle and more as a process of inquiry. Not simply as an exhibition to be seen, but a place to study the region through art. The future of the Biennale may not lie in expansion, but in its ability to remain accountable to the ground it inhabits while negotiating and, where necessary, reshaping the global structures it operates within. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for Anant Art Foundation for inviting me here. Thank you, Mira, and all the team for the organizations. And I'm very glad to be here and honored to see all the familiar faces here. So I think many of the lesson learned or the discourse that I want to offer here is very much related to that has been explained in the Bengal Biennale. I think we share lots of similarities. I think first also because somehow this kind of biennials in more peripheral contexts organized by small communities rather, so it's more like coming from below rather than organized top-down by the government. So I think it's something that we really share the spirit. So I would like to share our work in the Jogja Biennial in Indonesia for the last 15 years, and then also sharing a bit more how it evolves and going beyond the geographical into different projects, including our last project to carry with Natasha here in Sarjah Biennial. So my presentation will be somehow shared in these three different, or not really different, continuations, discourses on how we see new internationalism like biennial as international exhibition format as a strategy to rethinking power relation and transnational solidarity. And then the second one, how the biennial Jogja focusing on the working with the communities as a way of expanding the idea of public and praxis of collaboration. And then the last part of this presentation will be focusing on the how we see as, like most of my curatorial project, really much looking into women collective as subject, involving women's participations and transgenerational knowledge transmission. Can we play the video? So this mapping becoming our starting point when we, in 2010, the Jogja Biennial Foundation was established by the artist community. So it was founded by like maybe 10, 12 art activists and senior artists, curators, art organizers in the city. And the idea was very simple in the beginning. How do we want to be part of the global art world, for example? Because at that time, there was kind of like new spirit, new tendency to see Southeast Asia as a new emerging region, especially in the art market. But if you look into the ecosystem, the infrastructure, during the early 2000s until 2010s in Indonesia, we didn't really have international exhibition to start with. So the Biennial Jogja itself already has quite a long history in the city. We started in 1988, so now it's already 35 years. And we always like focus on like building the ecosystem in the city, in Yogyakarta or national. So in 2010, when the Biennale Foundation was established, the idea of how we can expand this biennial becoming international exhibitions. So it's very simple in the beginning, but then those people, our founders, they have very visionary thinking that we cannot just follow the international format offered by other biennials. First, also, we don't really have the infrastructures, we don't really have like huge exhibition space, and of course, the very limited funding we have. So the idea then to think of international as more political, geopolitical context rather than geographical context. And then they came up with this idea of creating the Jogja Biennial Equator. As you see in the map, most of the countries that we're working with, they have like the similar or shared experience as being part of equator area or being passed by the equator belt. So at that time, we define our working scope as 23 degrees above equator lines and 23 degrees below equator lines. So it's the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of, what is the other one? Of Capricorn. So for 12 years, so 6th edition, we did different projects with India the first time. I worked with Suman Gopinath to curate the first, and Anita Dubey's work also presented there. It's kind of like quite interesting exchange also, because it's most of the artists that invited at that time, we have Rias coming, and then Atul Dodia and some others. It was their first time to come to Indonesia, and they felt like the very strong relationship between the two cultures, two countries. But during the New Order era of Indonesia, this kind of relationship never really built. So it's kind of like there was a moment of disconnected for quite a long period of time. And then the second one, we worked with Arab region, the West Asia, and then the third edition, we worked with Nigeria, and then from Africa, we went to Brazil in 2017, and then we come back to our space in Southeast Asia, and then we ending the Equator series in Oceania or the Pacific. So after 12 years working on the notion of Equatorial project as an alternative offer of internationalism, and then we try to think of new direction that come from long reflection of what is the meaning of organizing biennial, what was the lesson learned that we had after 12 years we organized this, and how we created the relationship between city and the community. At the same time, our engagement with many artists and collective outside Java. So if you haven't been familiar with Indonesian context, during the New Order, the development of infrastructure very much focusing on Java Island, like maybe Java has 60% of Indonesian community, so it's like the very high populated island, and the rest of islands in Indonesia was kind of like left behind during 35 years of development. So this is including the artistic practices. So most of the practices that being seen as national identity is coming from Java, like the batik and wayang and the languages and the culture from Java somehow imported to, exported to other islands. And like for example, people from Papua, they have to learn to make batik or to play gamelan, which is actually, you don't really connect to their own culture. So during 12 years of working in the biennial, in the Equator projects, we invited many of the cultural activists, artists, community organizers from outside Java to come, and sometimes we also send artists from Java to come to different cities around Indonesia. This also led us to think of how we created like new engagement with the various indigenous community in Indonesia. And this had driven us to have more actions on decentralization and to collaborate with community on the site where we have life. Because we think also lots of projects done by artists involving participation of the community, but what happened always then the artworks or the result of the collaboration were displayed in the museum. And then the community, they never really have the access to the museum. So they never really see the actual works where they created together with the artists. So this kind of reflection also bring us to create like different approach. And then at the same time, at this point, I learned also on the idea of degrowth. Like for 12 years, we work on funding reports, very heavy financial, bureaucratic, and lots of burden on the working on the like more administrative context. And then at the same time, we had very heavy demand to have more quantities than qualities. The first question from the funding always, how many audiences you have, how many artworks being presented, how many artists participated in the biennale, is always about numbers. So I was trying to see what is the other possibility of growth that is not only about more in numbers, but also about social relationship. Could we as organizer of biennial also spend more time on process, on digging into erased history in the local narratives, and about the building a new horizon of conversations? So in the context of art production, from our experience, the growth also refer to thinking about production. How can we reduce the environmental impact of art making? So more and more we use thinking about materiality. How can we use the different materials that can be like somehow organically coming from the area, but also like recycle and different materials that coming around the site itself to minimize the waste. But at the same time, we think also thinking about process of a product, exploring the alternative forms of art that prioritize social and environmental impact. And then at the same time also to think that program is also part of our exhibition rather than a separate form of arts. So now we see some example of projects. That this is a project by a Taiwanese artist. He did research before in Indonesia, in Yogyakarta, about local mythology and folklore, and everything created by paper. So it's animation by Zhang Zuzang. So if you see the video, it's all made from paper mache, but also he created the space, like quite immersive space, made of newspapers, pile of newspapers. So it's quite interesting to see the metaphorical connection between the text, language, newspaper, and the mythology. And then this is a project by also Taiwanese artists. For 2025, we have a Taiwanese curator. That's why we have lots of projects by Taiwanese artists. This is very interesting also that the artists research on the history and the erasure history of the transgender community in the society in Yogyakarta, because Indonesia is also like always claiming as the biggest Muslim country in the world, but in the past we have quite long history of this inclusive gender acknowledgement. So in this project, the artist inviting transgender community from Yogyakarta and putting them in collaboration and in like meeting point with the group of transgender from Taiwan, both of them more coming from indigenous communities as well, to see how the notion and definition of gender in the indigenous community has very different structure rather than in the modern society. So since 2022, after the first series of Equator, we moved to the idea of transhistoricity and translocalities. And it's quite radical change that the main exhibition space, we moved out from the museum. So for 12 years, we did the exhibition in Jogja National Museum that used to be the art school, one of the biggest exhibition space in Yogyakarta. And we used that for 12 years. So for us, it's like something very familiar. For the audience also, they have very familiar feeling to the space. But since 2022, we started to think of moving out of the museum and focusing our project in the villages. So we work with 2-3 villages in every edition. In 2023, first edition of this series is curated by Adelina Luf from Romania, Silasa and Hitman from Nepal, and Ekanggalu from Maumere, Flores, Indonesia. This is also to expanding, like most of the prominent or well-known curators always coming from Java Island. So I think it's very important also to invite curator or even like practitioners coming from outside Java to be part of the rewriting history itself. So we use many of the community centers like old houses, studio, abandoned museum, abandoned local museum, even like open kitchen for everyone as part of our exhibition space. For us, the idea of village is not only represent a physical condition or definition, but also political and historical standpoint. The 2023 edition called T10 offered a very rich exchange between various indigenous practices. So we have like artists from, some from India, Nepal, Pakistan, so the South Asia focus. But at the same time, we wanted to build the narrative of the non-aligned movement because the first edition of Equator also very inspired by the Bandung Conference in 1955, and after Bandung, the world politics led into the 61 non-aligned movement. So many of the artists in this 23 edition also came from ex-Yugoslavian, which is very interesting. Also, they saw many traces of Yugoslavia industry in our exhibition. And then the second edition of this series is happened in 2025, curated by Eva Lin from Taiwan, Bob Adrian, and Kecil Bergerak from Indonesia. So, for example, this is one project by artists from South Sulawesi. So this is really to remind you that most of the artists during 25 years also coming from Java. This is from Sulawesi. This is project by Arah Mayani, where we did lots of participation with women in the villages, creating the choreography of moving and playing with the flags. And then this is another project where we invited the women's community to create big installations of different fiber and wire from the waste, the domestic waste, with artist Agnes Hansela. This is also architectural project in the Museum of Joko Pake by a female architect Novi Kristinawati, in collaboration with lots of bamboo artisans. There are lots of projects that very much like drawn the participation of women's community in the village. So they created their own songs, making choreography. So for us, it's all mostly about how you create a platform of bringing artists to dig into the everyday life of the people rather than creating the objects. So there is a collective aerobic in every village in Indonesia, and the artists created the song. So now in Yogyakarta, we share the songs with many different women's collectives. So in the morning when they do the aerobic together, they play the song by these artists, and also they create their own choreography. This is also a project made of the domestic plastic waste from women artists, but also involving music by female community, the women female collective. This is also the project from Anca Bukur from Romania. She's been researching on the female female collective in Romania that was very strong during the 70s. And in Yogyakarta, she also created the project together with the women farmer collective. So this is project to rethink of the archive of Mia Bustam, one of the forgotten artists in Indonesia because of her involvement during the political situation during 65. Okay, so I think I don't speak about the Sarjah now, but yeah, I will mention some during our discussion. Thank you very much.
Namaskaram, everyone. I've just arrived from Kerala, from Kochi, but can we not play the slideshow for just a second? Just if we can just take it to the... yeah, I just want to take a moment just to firstly say thank you. Thank you, Meera. Thank you, Mamta. Thank you, Anant. It's actually really wonderful to be back here for the second time. And it feels like it was 20 years ago, actually, because so much has happened in this 1 year. But I'm feeling, I'm a little nervous, but I'm also, in a strange sort of way, I'm also really relaxed because I'm amongst friends, I'm amongst collaborators, I'm amongst people who have partnered and worked together for many years. You know, Pooja, you've always inspired me and us to, you know, HH Art Spaces and what we created in Goa is a direct result of the many conversations and the work we've done together. Siddharth, it was amazing to be part of your Biennale, and I really enjoyed that. Sabih, ground beneath my feet at the Serendipity remains as one of my favorite projects. Natasha, thank you so much for being such an amazing collaborator, and so many of the artists that have made their way into the Biennale have been because of the friendships we have fostered and developed. I want to say, Mario, you've been amazing. Thank you so much. Natalie, great to have you. It's been wonderful to constantly be in conversation and dialogue with you. Anita, thank you for being part of the legacy of the Biennale and for paving the path. Rohini, we've done so much work at Coach together, so I just want to acknowledge. Murari, we've done work together, so it's, this is what sustainability, I guess, really starts to feel like. It starts to feel like, Shiba, I'm so happy that you were part of this Biennale and that we were able to bring your friendship with Janet. And there are many more people. And Shuddhabrata, thank you so much for saying that with your invitation, with my invitation to the Biennale, it would possibly be a Biennale about love. And that really stayed with me. I really kind of took that sentence and that comment with me into this mountainous task of putting together this Biennale. I have 130 slides to show you. Each slide will run for 8 seconds, which means that it's exactly 17 minutes and 33 seconds of a slideshow. I will have to constantly keep looking at it, so I'll be chasing the images as they keep going. So the idea is to hit play, and we will play as we go through this. So, on the water is perhaps one of the most exciting aspects of being on land, is to look at the water and to look at the water from this place of it being a highway, an ancient highway, a place where goods, spices, people, bodies moved through for generations and generations, for thousands of years. And that's why time, in a sense, becomes a very important material for us, for me. As when I was invited, I couldn't just think about myself as being the curator of this Biennale. I immediately thought about HH Art Spaces, an organization we started back in 2014. And with the same impetus that Kochi Biennale comes about, right? To say that, can our cities, our towns, and our villages be sites for creating international artistic experiences? And as someone who is an artist, which I think is a very important point that the Biennale makes, is that it invites an artist to curate this Biennale. In a sense, what we're being invited as guests is to be hosts, as where, how do you host as as if you were inviting someone to your home for dinner and asking them to cook the meal. And that's in a sense where a project like Panjeri Artist Union becomes very interesting, is sort of it exemplifies what we wanted to do with this Biennale, where we wanted to create active spaces, we wanted to create dynamic spaces, we wanted to invite artists who would use their spaces to have conversations, dialogues, presentations, screenings, performances. And Panjeri, I love the fact that they call themselves a union because it echoes very well in the narrative of Kerala as being a communist state, as unions do run that place. It sort of becomes interesting to invite a group of 14 artists to play host as guests. This is another project that I think really exemplifies what it is that this Biennale wanted to do, is when we invited Bani Abidi to present an artwork, she was immediately sort of reacting to this image of Gaza, where exactly one Ramzan or two Ramzans ago, one Ramzan ago, one Eid ago, there was a Dastarkhan that was spread across the rubble. And people found it solace in coming to eat together. And as the Dastarkhan project came alive, we also I invited her to think about the context of that and how we would create a space. And that's when she reached out to Anupama Kundu. So a Pakistani artist and an Indian architect sort of began to have this dialogue together in Berlin, where they were both living, ironically, at the same time. And they both invited each other. So the images on the Dastarkhan actually are when both these artists had hosted dinner parties in their houses and invited people to come and eat with them. And that's where these images and these graphic images emerge from, that do become that space where people eat and share. One of the things that we were very conscious with the Biennale was that we don't want to put things on ships. We had to, but we wanted to limit that. We wanted people to think about Kochi and Kerala as this really thriving, bubbling, multi-layered, multi-dimensional site where so many histories were being lived out in the now. And Utsa Hazarika, a young artist based in New York, loves to work in public spaces, and we invited her to take a look at the courtyard at Pepper House, which was a site that had been used very often, and it's one of the darling spaces of the Biennale, to construct what she called a giant periscope, inspired a lot by Jantar Mantar. Jantar Mantar architecture, cosmic architecture, a place to study the sky, becomes also a place for protest. The legitimate place for protest in this country becomes a very interesting backdrop then, or an interesting sort of inspiration for her to construct this enormous periscope that clears the horizon line and looks towards Gaza, sort of points northeast in exactly the same geographic sort of direction to Gaza. Sandra Mujinga, is an artist from Norway, but of Congolese origin, very aware of her identity, and how that sort of sits outside of what one understands as Norwegian. Builds these enormous sort of dinosaur-like creatures and drapes them with fishing net. In a way, it was very important for us to invite the presence of an artist in our exhibition, right? It was very important for us to think about how we can see or feel the presence of an artist in this exhibition. And it was very important for us to kind of connect them, not just to site, but also to people who they would develop friendships with and connections with. So Arden, actually, this incredibly talented group of welders and fabricators, then go on to construct these enormous sort of creatures on site. Otobong Kanga, one of my favorite artists and one of my really good friends now. And that's what's happened in this Biennale is that friendships have been forged. And, it's the conversations that have happened that have really enriched me and all of us. And Otobong didn't want to just give us an artwork. She wanted to give us an artwork that was in a constant state of change. So she builds this garden in a derelict part of one of the buildings. You must understand that we're working in difficult conditions where buildings are falling apart, they're derelict, and how do you bring precious contemporary art into these spaces? And so she builds this garden where the butterflies return, the birds return, she collaborates with a Malayali sound artists to play sort of subtle folk tales about their love for nature. And you see nature sort of coming back in this very poetic, flowery, beautiful, fragrant way. And in a sense, in this notion and relationship to time as material, what's really exciting is that the garden will live on even after the Biennale. So it's also not just what does a Biennale do in the now, but how does it leave behind a fragrance that lingers. Niroj Satpathy, I think he's a performance artist. I wish he was here in the audience. Birendra Yadav is, and I'm really happy to see him. One of the most exciting projects at the Biennale was Birendra's project. But what Niroj does is, with his life, is that he decides to literally live in one of the largest garbage dumps in Asia, which is, right around the corner from here in Okla. And he, in order to sustain his life and put food on his table, he gets a job as one of the caretakers of this what he calls and what we understand as hell, like absolute hell, where there is no difference between day and night. But also it's a symbol of the cultural detritus and the mirroring of like the other side of hyperconsumption and sort of neoliberalism that we have all become so subject to. So it's not just only a way for him to sustain his own body as an artist and as a person, but it's also a way for him to sustain a studio practice. So he rummages, he picks things out, he cleans them, he washes them, he categorizes them. And like a mad scientist would, or a mad anthropologist would, sort of places them very carefully in separate boxes and sort of labels them. And so he brings this, in a sense, this madness and creates monsters of what become sort of taxidermied sort of monsters with old people's dentures and, doll's eyes to create beasts that really are very representative of the bodies that emerged from the bodies that we create. And that idea of the body really being at the center of our sort of lens, because, I'm a performer, HH Art Spaces is primarily a space for live art and performance. We can't help but look at the world in that way. And I think that's the invitation, that the artist sort of extends out of their practice and decides to sort of invite practices that reflect on how they would like to think and how they would like to make. Nari Ward, again an artist who travels to India from New York, of Jamaican origin. What an amazing personality, charming, charismatic, takes his redi onto the streets of Bazaar Road and asks people to smile into cans that have a mirror in them, and encases these cans and shuts them. And this sort of becomes this kind of ever-growing, ever-evolving disco ball, if you will. And everyone is invited to place their smile onto the disco ball and take with them a random smile of a random person they don't know. All they know is that the smile exists in so many ways in their imagination. And that's, I think, this idea of what is it that we create. Are we creating objects? Are we creating experiences? Are we creating more garbage for Niroj Satpathy to rummage through? Or are we creating things that we want to hold dear and precious to us? And with that, I want to move into Island Warehouse, which is the risk I think we took, is that the plunge that we took to say, why do we want to limit ourselves to Fort Kochi? Why do we want to just, delve in nostalgia? And why aren't we looking at other spaces? And Willingdon Island became an interesting case in point, because we were able to take a new warehouse and place ancient wisdoms and practices in there. So, bringing Dineo Sheshi Bopape and her dialogue with Terracraft, an award-winning mud construction architecture organization, was one of the best sort of conversations that happened at the Biennale, really exemplary of what it is that we wanted to do. And, I really also wanted to show you images of process and how things are being built and how things are being made, as opposed to them being made, because process essentially was very, very central to the experience that we wanted to have and the experience we wanted to give. So that we're not just sort of, and I think the idea was to also kind of deflect attention away from our dependencies on the glossy screen, to have real, visceral, tactile experiences, things that you can touch, smell, taste, walk into, sit in, immersed in, surrounded by, and to feel that your body was part of that experience and not disembodied from that experience. And with Kerala and Kochi, I mean, imagine 700,000 people have come through this Biennale, and that really talks about who we are talking to. And therefore it becomes very important, it's not just what we are showing, but how we are then showing it becomes very, very important. Vinoja, as you go through Island Warehouse, at one end, of course, you enter Dineo's incredible domes, her mother domes, almost like she is as someone who feels very motherly, wants to hold you as you walk through it. As you let go of Dineo and you walk towards the end of Island Warehouse, we sort of end the Biennale with an installation that's directly juxtaposed against Marina Abramovich's Waterfall, which is 108 monks and nuns all chanting together to sound, heart chakra, to sound like the waterfall. Vinoja builds her bunkers which are a memory of her life in North Sri Lanka, which is, and she's of course of the Tamil community there, and is very much a part of that history of the genocide, and she has that memory of war and how they hid and how they huddled together, how they held each other through one of the most difficult times in the history of this island, which is why I think segueing into this idea of making a Biennale that's alive, that's not just alive, but also that's live, is something that I think we drew a lot of, we had a lot of desire to do that. And Anya Ipsh is someone who does that immaculately. She is there in her space right now as we speak, spending 110 days every day in her space, using it as a studio, as a theater, as a conversation space, as a space of interaction, as a space for creating images and experiences. She's someone who comes from, the Black Market Theatre Performance Group, a student of Boris, and we worked with them before. So, this legacy of making images in the live moment and the now is something that, I, as a performer, am very sort of attracted to. And, you can see how this piece has evolved, right? So this piece is never still. So what you see today, you will not see tomorrow. It's the idea of, if you're getting FOMO, then too bad. I prefer the word MOMO, which is you missed out. There's no way for you to have that experience again. And so she's someone who's also suffers from I don't want to use the word disability, just like I don't want to use the word limited resources, because I think Kerala and India often get mistaken for that idea that we have limited resources. But I think that when you understand resources as something larger than capital and technology, you understand that, we have access to so many wisdoms and so many different living traditions that are alive even today. I mean, the access that we've had to textile, to weavers, to sculptors, to artists working with ceramic and textile and architecture and rammed earth have really, really been a very important part of us extending the idea of what resources mean. Inviting Yuko Kaseki there, a Buto dancer and an artist, was super important. She is someone who really sort of expresses in her body of how and what the current state of the world is, where she drowns, in a sense, in her own blood in this performance in what used to be the swimming pool of the director of Directors Bungalow in Aspinwall House. And, is someone who is a master of image making and a master of expressionism. Uriel Barthélemy is a French artist that, like Yuko, I've been working with Yuko and collaborating with her for the past 10, 12 years. Uriel is another artist I've been collaborating for the past 10 years. And he brings his drum kit out and creates this sort of incredibly experimental sound piece, but also gives us a moment to let go, to dance, to celebrate, in a sense, in very difficult times, to use the language of art as a means of finding joy and a moment of release, where everyone sort of breaks into sort of a dance. Hiten Patel is an artist that I've been following, and I love his work. He lives in London. And this is what I think was really kind of key in our Biennale, was that artists, like Mario mentioned, have gifted us, I would say, spaces to invite people. So, this idea of when does the guest become the host and the host become the guest, is something that is an idea that I guess as an artist myself I've been playing with for a long time. And this is when Ibrahim Mahama's Parliament of Ghosts, becomes a parliament of performers, where the ghosts, in a sense, become really very much a part of what it is that we want to do. And of course, I thought I should end it with Marina Abramovich, with just this one image, where inviting her and having her presence really felt in many ways like a blessing. Yeah, so my mother and father were meeting for the first time in 25 years. And, in this question of what does it mean to curate, I thought it would be interesting to bring my two parents together at a moment when I had, created something, and I was really enjoying the success of that. And I thought that they should meet each other. And the next slide will show you me sitting down and having a meal with my parents, which I haven't done in 35 years. So this was really, I think, the best artwork at the Biennale. But it really said, how can you curate an international art exhibition or create an international art exhibition if you're not able to do that at home, And it was a very emotional moment, and the memories of each other that my parents had, because I was sick and tired of hearing them bitch about each other for all these years. And now they sat together, and their chemistry was really palpable. I could see, and they held each other's hand, and I could see the love that they had for each other in their eyes, and the fact that they apologized to each other, and they apologized to me. And I was like, no, this is not about that. This is about celebrating the fact that, if there's one thing that you may have done well, was perhaps make me. So thank you for allowing me to have this platform.
Good afternoon, everyone. Took a whole Biennale to do this, huh? That's probably the reason you did the Biennale and accepted the invitation. Good afternoon. It's really wonderful to be back in Delhi. I think it goes without saying that India, and Delhi particularly, has been probably one of the most vibrant and electrifying sites for discourses on Biennales, and this is just a testament to that. So congratulations and thank you, Mamta, Meera, Kanika, Dia, and everyone else involved. I'm going to be speaking about the Diriya Contemporary Art Biennale, where me and Nora Razian were the artistic directors. But before that, I just wanted to open the aperture a little bit to really situate where our questions were coming from and where we might be looking at Biennales when we talk about them today. What is the site of a Biennale? What is the jurisdiction of an artwork? The constituency of events like these? Is it simply the local? And what does the local mean when a supply chain getting blocked in the Strait of Hormuz is affecting the availability of gas for cooking in New Delhi, right? Which is then having a dominoes effect of people leaving the city because they don't have enough livelihood here from within Delhi to other hometowns. So when we started the curatorial premise and process of curating the... Am I audible, by the way? I'm a little far from the mic. Is it okay? Yeah, a little louder? Okay. So when we started working on this Biennale, we were first trying to just ask the question that where are we now and when are we now? And obviously, we were aware that we're in the first quarter of the 21st century, which also means that maybe we need to reevaluate, have a new appraisal of the paradigms, concepts, theoretical frameworks within which we sense the world, we understand the world, and our relationships as living beings. We were also looking at the question of what does periodicity of 2 years mean in these days, in these present times, and especially in days which suddenly feel extremely amplified in terms of just awareness of the world, and then suddenly a hyper-localization of experiences. And this is particularly felt, say, since COVID. You were extremely aware of something so personalized, maybe within your own body, and at the same time something that is way beyond you. It was also a good time to reflect on the relationship of publics, institutions, art, and artists. What relationship do these have with each other now that we're in the first quarter of the 21st century? And as Nikhil mentioned about the ground, we had done this project many years ago called The Ground Beneath My Feet. And the question is, what is the ground beneath our feet? How vast does it go, or how localized is it? And so, since this Biennale is situated in Diriyah, I will talk about Diriyah in Saudi Arabia in a bit. It was a good moment to also reflect on how does the world appear from the Gulf, not how the Gulf appears to the world, because we know how the Gulf appears to the world. It appears through Al Jazeera news, it appears through CNN, it appears through remittance economies, it sometimes appears through packets of Toblerone chocolates that some relatives bring over, through TVs and appliances in certain times, but it also appears through many other vectors. I thought I'll just quickly put together a slideshow of how does the world appear through all of these airline routes, which are constantly getting rearranged as we see these days in the news, through shipping routes. These are from 10 years ago, by the way. They've only intensified. Through the arteries of railway systems, right? And it's said that actually all of the railway lines combined can rotate the world around 30 times. Through airline routes, and everyone's seeing images similar to these. This is not from this year. This is from June last year when attacks on Iran and Qatar were taking place. And it's interesting because there was once a time when a clear sky meant a happy day, a sunny day. Now clear skies mean a turbulent earth. Or when 27 million tons of sand move every year from sub-Saharan Africa all the way to the Amazon and create a river of sorts up in the skies that only satellites are able to see. And this has been happening for centuries. So what if we started kind of looking outside of the cartographic model? What forms, images, metaphors, lexicons would appear if we were to look at these vectors that not only shape the world, but that are the world, right? Oh, by the way, the previous slide is a mapping of the transmission of the COVID virus from 2020 to 2025, the density of its transmission. Or a map of people who were seeking refuge, practically refugees mapped by the UN, so there's a lot of unreported data, and what kind of a constellation on the planet does that form? And this is again from 2015, so a decade ago. These would only have been more intensified. And this is just literally from yesterday, talking about clear skies, turbulent earth, what's going on, how does one look at the vectors that shape the present time. Interestingly enough, while we're looking at flights, about 500 million birds travel through all the way from Lebanon to Jordan, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Sudan, every year, 500 million. That's 500 million one way and 500 million the other way. And the question is, what do they see when they meet all the drones that are also here? We found in our research a very interesting kind of coincidence that about 8% of the global drone production is happening in this region that I've just outlined, which is also the kind of highway for about 9% of the global migratory bird population. So basically you're looking at 10% of the world's migratory birds meeting 10% of the world's drones. And what happens when they meet? They end up becoming anti-Zionist, it looks like. So we were thinking about the world not through maps and cartographies, because how does the world appear today? And probably it is through these kinds of transmissions. And these transmissions is what we over time kind of developed into thinking about processions. If they were embodied, all of these transmissions, then what would those transmissions look like? They would be processions of birds, processions of viruses, processions of shipping containers, but also processions of people taking to the streets, processions of people who were displaced and not being able to go home and displaced on the streets. And it's interesting that, I mean, in the course of our research, we were seeing that there's been a lot of, is there a laser thing on this? Yeah. We were noticing that what has characterized a lot of the movements in the past 25 years that have taken place around the world, and while many of the big like political and social movements that took place had leaders in the 20th century, a lot of them, and we've seen them in the city of Delhi, now appear leaderless, they're anonymous. The self appears through a kind of distributed network of sensibilities and subjects. And of course, what happens when people have their ID cards taken from them, their own, the very vectors of identity sometimes lost to bombings or displacements. But then what constitutes identity then is a question. But on a zoomed out picture, while I'm talking about the social strata, there's also a lot happening in the microbial kind of dimension, which is that back in 1800s, Pasteur actually discovered that bacteria's, trillions of them, bacteria, fungi, viruses are up in the clouds, but they're not just living up in the clouds, they literally shape weather, right? And it's said also from a microcosmic perspective that about 2 kgs of an average adult, a human being, is comprised of bacteria. So I think Bruno Latour used to joke that when two people fall in love, it's not me in love with you, but a village of bacteria inside me in love with a village of bacteria inside you, right? And so the kind of processions we're talking about, they're happening around us, they're happening above us, and they're happening through us, through our digestive tracts. We're tasting supply chains when we're eating a tomato brought from one side to another of the planet, right? So these are the kinds of processions that we thought are going to be what we have to talk about. And we were aware that this notion of the procession, this notion of collective movement, sometimes by choice, sometimes by circumstance, are not just coming as an invented idea by us. We were aware that these are being discussed by so many different interesting practitioners and biennales. So we were aware, of course, of the cycles of itinerancy that, I mean, when I was involved with the Shanghai Biennale in 2016 that was curated by Rux, we were looking at not the list of artists, not the inventory of artworks, but the itinerary of practices. We were also thinking about, say, the cycles of Biennale that surrounded us. The recent Sharjah Biennale was titled To Carry, and we saw in Natasha's presentation such kinds of ideas elaborated and expressed. So transmissions becoming processions, and every transmission, as we know, also leads to transformation, right? And so how does one map all of this? And in order for that to express itself in a biennale, we had to rethink, or at least make this an opportunity to rethink paradigms, lexicons, metaphors, and images. This is the kind of brief we were also sharing with artists and developed many of the projects in conversation with those. You know, back in the day, about a decade ago, Nicholas Mirzoff had written this book around visuality, and he was asking this question of how do we see climate change? And in order to see climate change, you'll have to change the very notion of seeing to other technologies and techniques of sensing. Susan Shipley from the forensic architecture talked about dirty pictures. We'd have to think about not high resolution clean pictures, but messy, dirty, layered pictures, but also pictures that are entangled, interrupted. The notion of the embodied that has been privileged so far in a lot of the conversations today, but also the disembodied that connects us, and new kinds of augmentations. The notion of concentration and gathering, but also dispersals. Because I mean, when you're in the Gulf, you really realize the dispersal of entities, forces that constitute you and your everyday life. So when you come to the question of scale, it really isn't as simple as what's immediately surrounding me in my locality. The locality is shaped as, I mean, I don't even need to emphasize, based on basically millions of barrels of ships, barrels inside ships moving from one place to another. We were also thinking about what kind of curatorial methodologies should we develop if we're asking these questions. Because if you're looking at some of the diagrams I've shared today, they are not simply going to suffice to look at maps and cartography. We'll have to start looking at the choreography of those vectors. So therefore, something will have to change in the way we think about maps. We also realize, even though my own long, deep investment in archives is not going to suffice, so we're not going to stage archives, we might need to question archives. So not archives, not archaeology, not genealogy, because I mean a formulation that me and my colleagues at Asia Art Archive shared was that to be archiving in the 21st century is like being an archaeologist in the middle of an earthquake. You think you're excavating, the earth is already in a state of upheaval of sediments. And so, what does it mean then to kind of curate in such a time frame, such a method? And then the history or the historical tools that you have don't quite suffice. We might need to think of history as a continuum of multiple timelines that are human, planetary, mythological, rather than fixed chronologies. And so the approach we had then was towards the sonic as a method. And we've seen a lot of emphasis on sound and the sonic happen all around us. Again, following the larger cycles of biennales, we've been looking at, we're about to see In Minor Keys, curated by Koyo for the upcoming Venice Biennale, but also Whispers on the Horizon by Sam and Till in Taiwan, and so many other kinds of curatorial projects that have been happening that have been looking at the sonic. But we thought it's an important moment to look at the sonic as a method, and what would that look like or sound like? It would take us not into excavation, unearthing, unveiling, but rather think about reverberations, echoes, amplifications, chants, songs, fluidity of oral cultures, the multitude of languages, dialects, accents, and impure tongues. We were partly inspired also by Edward Glissant's idea of echo monde, the world as resonance, vibration, echo, and polyphony. Something beautiful Glissant used to say is to think about trembling with the world. With the world is very important. Not trembling in the world, not being in a world that is trembling, but trembling with it, almost like being tuning forks. But then what happens when about 8 billion, but also over trillions of living things are tuning forks? Who are they trembling with, and what is the kind of syncopation that we have to think with? You know, I recently discovered, reading a book by Thomas Nail, about the kind of ratio of human population with regard to the rest of the living things in the world. And I brought this up in a class and it was very revealing. Can you guess what is the percentage of human beings, don't Google it, in relation to the rest of living things in the world? Just a quick guess, we won't have time. Less than 1%, yeah, 0.01%. About 83% of the planet is made of trees. 13% of bacteria. 13%. They're not in our world, we're in their world of bacteria. Only 5% of other animals, and 0.01 of human beings. That's how little. But again, the question of scale then is not as simple as we think. A 0.01 is affecting certain kinds of changes that are being regarded as Anthropocene. But we know that word doesn't work. It doesn't. You can't equalize all human life into one category of the Anthropocene vis-a-vis the planet. So trembling with the world was something that we were inspired by, and therefore looking at nomadic distributions of power. So where does this Biennale take place? This is the larger framework when we were thinking about Biennales. I'll conclude also later on with talking a little bit about situating Biennales today, but it takes place in Diriyah. Now, the relevance of Diriyah, much like Kochi actually, is that it's a historical name for a region that also kept changing its contours and borders. When the place we look at on the map is Mecca and Medina, major pilgrimage sites, were once occupied by the Ottoman Empire, and it was the family that was ruling Diriyah that tried to take over and contain it within Saudi Arabia, and then there were many tussles on the way. So Diriyah is a historical site, and it's located within today's Riyadh. As you can see when you read in the news and hear on news channels, a lot of explosions and bombs are detonating in these areas, but they're not in Riyadh because Riyadh is landlocked. Why I wanted to show you this map is because you can see that Saudi Arabia is much, much larger than what you can see of the UAE or Qatar. It's a very large country. It has a very diverse ecosystem of mangroves, mountains, snow, desert. So just to think about these places only as deserts is already a simplification. And most importantly, I think being in such a strategic space as the news keeps telling us, or history books tell us, across East and West, North and South, they've also been attuned to the tremors of global shifts, of resource distribution, of networks of knowledge, nomadic knowledges, as well as religious pilgrimage. And so the title of the Biennale, this is where the Biennale takes place. It is in an ancient valley called the Wadi Hanifa. And these warehouses are where the Biennale takes place, just these. The rest is also warehouses, but artist studios. If some of you have been to Al Circle Avenue in Dubai or have heard of it, imagine the site being Al Circle Avenue multiplied by 10 in terms of scale. But more importantly, I think what is worth looking at is what does it mean to curate in these warehouses, the amount of resource that goes into warehouses that are going back to Tabula Rasa. Right? It's interesting because one of the sites of the Kochi Biennale this time was in a warehouse too, the newly developed site, in which the warehouse-ness of the warehouse was made very apparent. So it takes place along this valley. We decided to utilize the valley. The Biennale is titled in Interludes and Transitions. It was actually first an Arabic title, Fil Hil wa Tirhal, a nomadic terminology coming from the Bedouin communities in the Arab world, not just within Saudi Arabia, which basically translates to the cycles of encampments and movements. So instead of settling and moving being opposite to one another, these are considered as part of a cycle of itinerancy. So those who settle, those who move are not in opposition to one another, but in fact there are lives lived. And in fact we may ask ourselves the same question. For instance, we all often go to places and someone may ask, where are you from? And you'll at least mention 3 places. It won't be just one place. I'm from here, but my parents were from there, and these days I'm living there. So you're also then even asking a question that doesn't make sense in a single site of origin or a single site of occupancy or belonging, but vectors of those. And so maybe the question might need to change to, where all are you from? Right? Adding that word, and what does that kind of produce in terms of subject formations? So in Interludes and Transitions was a kind of non-literal translation of Fil Hil wa Tirhal, drawing from the sonic, from the performative kind of modes of life, but also expression. So every interlude also leads to a transition into the next act. The Biennale was really premised on certain ideas that then got kind of encapsulated into these 5 sections. Disjointed choreographies. I'll be quickly taking you through them and not going into great detail. How much time do I have? 2 minutes? Oh dear, okay. Hall of Chants, a collective observation, Forest of Echoes, and arenas. It was spread across these different warehouses. And it starts actually, the opener act was by Muhammad al-Hamdan, this phenomena in Saudi Arabia who's really representing the younger voice in the kingdom, who's got millions of followers, but is also a music icon and quite an interdisciplinary artist. Very young, as you can see. And the interesting thing with Saudi Arabia is that unlike the rest of the Gulf countries, it has a very large, practically 60+% of people are from Saudi Arabia. So they're Saudi nationals, they're not immigrants, they're not migrants. And a large part of them are under 35 years of age. So it's a very young. Mirzov also used to say that we might want to characterize the world today as young, hot because of global warming, and connected because of just the connectivity, right? And so Muhammad al-Hamdan really encapsulates all of those 3 typologies. And so it starts with the Wadi Hanifa and a procession actually which was titled Folding the Tents of Camels, but the new generation of camels, which are Toyota SUVs. And these Toyota SUVs are not just, and this was not like some traditional invocation of nomad. This is how a lot of nomadic culture now and Bedouin culture is taken into the 21st century in Toyota SUVs, a very specific model that's called the Shas. So the Shas was being used. This is not a Shas. This is the Lexus-sponsored car, which is a variant of Toyota. So this was in the middle of many Toyota Shasas, which were not bought for the Biennale, but actually many people who drive them around were invited to be part of this procession with a musical score by Hamdan. Disjointed choreographies. I'm going to just race through now because of limited time. 1 minute? Okay, so 1 minute and 50 slides. Petrit Helilai from Kosovo, and looking at basically his diary from age 13 when he was actually in a refugee camp in Albania because of the Kosovo War. And he revisits that diary after 21 years and blows up those drawings into these felt prints, and you're invited to walk inside them. But as you turn around, while it looks like a childlike drawing of trees and animals and birds, you end up seeing tanks and people in exile and houses burning as children left alone. This was the process of him back in the day. So actually, how do we assemble a Biennale based on an aesthetics of fragility, of fragments, of exiled stories that can be pieced together? Daniel Lynn Ramos from Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico has seen a lot of course, the longer history of Afro-Caribbean enslavement and trade, but also hurricanes more recently. And he, being a senior artist there, actually is offered, gifted things from the community, which he assembles together in these large kind of fragile monuments or commemorations of various families whose names may not be recorded in history, but whose lives are kind of somewhere connected to these objects. And many of them are actually musical instruments, thinking of the sonic. Ambulencia. Okay, I'm out of time. Okay, so just to quickly race through, Tao Nguyen Phan, looking at the long shadows of history. You know, there was a beautiful work by the Packet and Kochi Biennale, The Heavy Weight of Tiny Little Things. And Tao Nguyen Phan is in conversation with Dim Fung Thi, looking at monuments that never got realized. So small becomes big and big becomes small. Processions of objects, entities, Yuji from China, looking at urban detritus, in conversation with Hazim Harb from Palestine, looking at gauze, gauze which actually has an etymology in and from Gaza because of a certain kind of weaving. And so absent bodies, if there are bodies that are in procession that are human, social, but they're also microbial, but also absent bodies, broken bodies, bodies running. Ahad Al-Amudi, a young artist from Saudi Arabia, running through the landscape of Neom, where the lion is, but also through the simulation of the same landscape within. Hall of Chant, Rajesh Vangar, looking at the chorus of many, all into one painting that he made recently. Ethiopian artist Elia Sime, looking at urban detritus and urban waste, but also kind of configuring them also almost like satellite images, but of a jigsaw puzzle of the Earth, of the planet, constantly rearranging itself. I'm done. Okay. So, lots of images, KP Reggie. Yep, okay. Sudani. Okay, so I will end. I just want to show one thing in the end. I think I took the prelude too long. Raqs Media Collective's work, Shadia Alam's. We had some activations, George Mahashe, Augustine Woodgate. But the curatorial team, we had an expanded curatorial team. So instead of, we had a compressed timeline of the Biennale to do this in 1 year. So instead of going out and traveling and scouting for artists, we thought this is going to be an opportunity to actually involve a cohort of our co-thinkers, our generation, and with them bring their networks of existing research into the Biennale. So on the blue you see our curatorial teams, the green is Sami Zarqa, and the rest. Okay, thank you very much.
What really strikes me is that I think the four positions that you represented constitute a reconfiguring of what the Biennale is today. Because from Nikhil's reunion with his parents to the way in which the Al-Chiki script comes on in Shantiniketan, to how, Alia, you talked about the time of remembering the New Order time and producing that, and finally to your wonderful figuration of the procession. In each of these, what I find interesting is that there is a kind of, and we were talking about this day before yesterday at Khoj, that these exhibitions become new geological maps of the world. They're not political maps of the world, but they're actually a new geology. They're eruptions, they're tectonic plates meeting each other, both at the small scale of a family as well as at the larger scale of the world. And I'm very grateful for getting that insight from you.
Can I add one thing to this? Thank you for mentioning this, Shraddha. Actually, a very significant part of our thinking process was also to look at the relationship between the world, the globe, and the planet. Because I think we're seeing the tension across these three categories. If the globe, and a large part of the Biennale discourse has been about the global and the local, we knew that that's not really applying. How do you really bifurcate or even go into local anymore? It doesn't quite work the same way. Everything is hyper-localized and hyper-globalized at the same time. So that's a kind of economic model. Then you have, of course, the planet, which is the geological and the tectonic, but also the social imbricated within it. And the world is a philosophical, social philosophical kind of category. So it was a good opportunity actually to think about the tensions between the world, the globe, and the geologic or the planetary. And I think you're absolutely right, because our starting point was the planetary and resisting the global, which has largely been the dominant discourse in thinking the world. And then kind of seeing how the world works in its marvelous ways with it.
I want to add one more also fact that I haven't mentioned before, because actually it's not always success story. When the shifting of geological or the forming of new geological formation came, I think, for example, in Jogja, as the word or the definition of Biennale somehow already established, like you imagine Gwangju or you imagine Venice or you imagine Sydney, wherever. But this become like the set of expectation from the people, the local people or the local arts community. So when we move out from the museum and then we started to do the projects in the villages, the expectation still there. So many people, actually we got like so bad reviews from the local communities, local audiences, like mostly coming from the artists, but I think it's also important to have this shifting to experiments, to somehow thinking about new formation of Biennales itself, to create new definition rather than stuck in a same situations most of the time. So for us, it's also important that this kind of discussion that coming from some people really, for me, maybe it's also failure. I mean, I didn't really close the possibility that people think this is a failure because you don't reach the expectations of the common people, of the audiences, that they are somehow grown up like with the idea of art in a white cube, in a very proper space, like a very well organized team. So everything is came up, but then when they come to see the exhibition, it's not really the thing they thought. But for us, it's also important, like to take these notes and bringing them and create the conversations with the villagers itself. But so it's not always success story. Yes.
Well, on that note, thank you everyone. And I'd just like to end with a lovely, very short part of a quote by Arundhati, which she says, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing."
Thank you everyone. We'll see you at 3 o'clock.